I call Fletcher Tabuto.
Thank you, sir. New Zealand First stands in support of this piece of legislation, but just to touch on a few issues raised by previous members, perhaps borrowing at 3% or even 0% to grow your investment at what was acknowledged as 18% last year makes more sense in terms of government spending than selling off capital assets that were returning such strong dividend returns to this government and the people of New Zealand. Although I think actually the argument was that a surplus would be needed in order for the government contributions to begin once again. Look, this is a large $29 billion fund. It is a successfully managed fund, and New Zealand First has supported this fund since its inception. It's still disappointing to note that the Minister has previously stated, even knowing how well it has performed over recent history, that he would still not have contributed to the government contributions, even given perhaps even with a surplus. So the bill, if I can, you'll forgive me, I'll just go through some of the detail here. I was not part of the Select Committee, so it's important that we go through, for New Zealand First, some of the detail and acknowledge the work of the Select Committee members. The bill seeks to amend Part 2 of the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Act 2001 to facilitate the efficient and effective investment of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund by the guardians of said fund and to help protect the guardians from liability. So the principal change would be to allow the guardians to control fund investment vehicles, which we've discussed in quite some detail here. The committee received and considered only 3 submissions, heard oral evidence from 1 submitter and received advice from Treasury. No submissions opposed or actually identified any real problems, although 2 matters were raised by submitters where amendments to the bill could be considered, namely the Legislation or Advisory Council's recommendation around validation provisions and the applicability of the OIA. So the Guardians is an autonomous Crown entity with the sole purpose of managing and administering the fund. Consultation with the Guardians was undertaken on the original policy decisions prior to the submissions by Cabinet, which New Zealand First acknowledges. And during the drafting process, the Inland Revenue Department, the State Services Commission, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and the Office of the Auditor General were also consulted on the relevant issues. Questions raised related to taxation, and I noticed the previous member spoke to that issue, which I'll come back to, and responsible investment. At present, Section 59 of the Act prevents the Guardians from controlling any other entity. This restriction is considered inconsistent with the Guardian's obligations under the Act to invest the fund in a way consistent with best practice portfolio management and to maximise returns without undue risk to the fund as a whole. Allowing the use of the FIVs is expected to enable the government to structure fund investments more efficiently, resulting in cost savings and to manage risk more effectively. Clauses 6 and 7. These clauses amend Section 59 and insert new Section 59A to permit the Guardians to use FIVs for the purpose of investment fund. This has had the effect of preventing, the current legislation has had the effect of preventing our Guardians from using some very effective tools. Now the Guardians can own assets without the presumption or inference they will be running the business themselves. The Guardians have estimated in their preamble to the government that the historical cost of not being able to control these passive holding companies, for example, is around $50 million. This is quantified net opportunity costs, additional risk and agency cost, although they acknowledge the difficulty of doing that. Treasury views the cost savings calculated by the government, the Guardians, are not the primary driver for the legislative change. They note that actually the $50 million itself and the $25 million costs of large short-term movements and particular investments in total are not a significant amount of money given the actual size of the fund itself. To my next point, New Zealand First, and it's been spoken of as a negative by the other side of the House, but New Zealand First has always said and always suggested that investment into New Zealand by the fund itself is a critical investment into this country and the people of this country. And I note, sir, that the Guardians themselves are actually working to increase, or are working to increase, the proportion of the fund invested in New Zealand assets. The limited size of the New Zealand market means it must purchase real assets as well as shares. And it is my understanding that it is these very FIV vehicles which will enable the Guardians to do this very thing. Prohibition on control does not preclude the fund from 100% ownership of assets. The Select Committee considered it desirable to reinforce the intention that the FIVs themselves be related to passive holdings of entities, and that the Act provides a mechanism for scrutiny and control of the government arrangements. The Select Committee suggested 2 new sections, and we've talked about this as a positive, but there's some debate as to that. But I think in this context, and I think my caucus would approve, this would mean that the Minister for Finance would specify the class of investment or entity for which an FIV could be used, and to stipulate governance arrangements for the entity. So I think that is reasonable control. I think it is not interference by the Minister, and at least initially at this stage of this piece of legislation, we would support those additions. Other proposed amendments make 3 relatively minor changes. Clause 5 aims to strengthen confidence in commercial transactions entered into by the Guardians, and the Guardians from any potential challenges that their investment decisions lack statutory authority. The Select Committee recommended replacing Clause 5 in the bill as introduced with different formulations which would achieve the intended purpose in a much more straightforward way. The second would be allow the board of the Guardians to delegate operational functions. The third, make it explicit that the fund is not an entity separate from the Crown. We would note that the current wording does leave some uncertainty about the fund's sovereign nature. It is also important to note that the bill also makes consequential amendments to the Income Tax Act, and we were assured by the statement in the Select Committee, but the previous member did note that some of these FIVs have allowed what we would consider to be perhaps maybe classed as minor tax evasion and standard tax evasion tools. But the last thing New Zealand First would support would be introducing FIVs in order to allow large-scale tax evasion, sir. Sir, the reasons for the support from New Zealand First is the FIVs are a simple and commonly used tool which will allow the Guardians to make more effective investment decisions, and I note that this would allow more investment in New Zealand, provide a suitable balance between allowing the Guardians access to new vehicles in terms of the investment funds efficiently and effectively. And, sir, we also note that the Act makes sure that the FIVs themselves are not subject to OIAs, but the Guardians are. So, with all that detail in mind, sir, New Zealand First will support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call